Royal Recruits have been one of the most hated cards in the competitive scene of Clash Royale since the day they were introduced. It's a 7 elixir common card that spawns 6 units, and they don't have any unique ability. They function as a basic melee unit. So why would something like this be so hated in the competitive scene specifically? Well, it goes beyond their general power level. What makes Royal Recruits so special is their formation, which causes them to spawn across the entire arena. This severely limits their placement options and thus the skill ceiling. Basic cards can be a good thing for Clash Royale, but remember this is 7 elixir, the most expensive common card, and when you combine a basic mechanic with something really expensive, it's going to provide a lot of value for just a single placement. There were many calls to delete this card within days of its addition, and although they haven't done that, they haven't exactly been giving this card a lot of love over the years. There was so much hatred towards this card that Supercell ended up giving it the biggest nerf in Clash Royale history. So let's go back to when this card was first released, cover the balance changes it's received, and see how it ended up where it is today. Royal Recruits were first available to play on July 20th, 2018 via a special challenge. Their deploy formation was the big selling point of this card. No matter how you played them, they would cover the arena from end to end, 3 on each side. And they were pretty tough troops. Even one of them left alone would be able to deal damage to the tower. In a lot of situations, you wouldn't be able to utilize all 6 though. For example, if the opponent placed a Hog Rider and you used the Royal Recruits to counter, some of them would just walk away. Those wandering ones would still require some attention, but the best situation to use these guys in was when there were troops coming in both lanes. This era was the peak of 3 Musketeers. Split lane pressure decks involving that were hot, and it could get very overwhelming very fast as a defender. Now there was a card to keep that in check. Instead of having to worry about dictating how much elixir to spend on each side using multiple cards, you could just throw down a row of recruits. Spells weren't good against them either. Not only did their spread out positioning make it impossible for any one spell to hit all of them, but they each had their own individual shield. This part was revolutionary in another way because shields had never been given to a non-epic card as they were always considered a more complicated mechanic. Guards were an epic, and they were essentially just normal skeletons without their shields. Supercell had wanted to downplay the significance of shields though. As more cards got them and more complex mechanics were added, shields just weren't as special anymore. Although I'm still surprised they weren't an epic, not just because of the deployment, but because this card's original design was just going to be 8 guards with the name Guard Battalion. Since guards were epic, it would naturally make sense for another guards related card to be an epic. The troop was changed into something new for 2 reasons though. One being that the team felt like just taking an already existing troop and jumbling them around would be underwhelming for a new card. It would have felt like adding the minion horde 2 years after minions were already in the game. Additionally, the fast speed and fragile nature of guards didn't fit the vision Supercell had for this card. They wanted something a bit more bulky and slow, something you could build counter pushes with. Supercell had worked so hard to get this card right that they'd actually gone through 5 iterations before reaching the final state. The second iteration had 8 recruits for 8 elixir, keeping the shield HP of guards, but the base health was raised to match archers, and the movement speed was reduced to medium. However, this iteration was extremely bad. Even just a log or any splash troop was good at dealing with them with the assistance of the tower. The third iteration raised their health to match Zappies, but decreased their movement speed to slow. It seemed to work a lot better, but in playtesting these Royal Recruits worked excellently with 3 Musketeers, which was the opposite of their goal, so it was reworked again. This time the elixir cost was reduced to 7, but the total number of units went from 8 to 6. And now you would always have the same number of units on each side, 3 and 3, unlike the previous iteration which allowed you to split 5 on one side and 3 on the other. At this point, they were still okay, but didn't feel that impactful, and that's what led to them to reduce the elixir cost again down to 6, and increase their movement speed to medium while slightly decreasing their damage. That's right, originally Royal Recruits only cost 6 elixir to play. Reducing the cost was done very late into playtesting, and this change was looked back upon as being a huge mistake. Seth, the community manager himself, would soon come out and say this was his biggest regret because on launch, this card was game-breakingly overpowered. In fact, some argued it was the most overpowered card in Clash Royale history, and they may not have been wrong. Within days, this card had risen to be in more than half of Grand Challenge decks with a 63% win rate. This card was not only helping 3 Musketeers immensely, which is the opposite of what they wanted, but literally any and every archetype. Even Golem and Lava Hounds players were using it, which was shocking considering how heavy these decks already were. Recruits could counter most ground things fairly well and always apply pressure to both sides. It was almost impossible to defend them properly for a positive elixir trade, and there was almost never a situation where playing them wouldn't provide adequate value. If you play any other card poorly enough, it can get 0 value, even if it's really good, but recruits would always get at least a little. Because of this fact, and since it had so few placement options, players soon began calling this the lowest skilled card in the game. If you can't get punished for playing badly, then how is a pro player supposed to separate themselves? A lot of players were worried that Royal Recruits set a precedent of Supercell adding very low skill cards, which would take away from the competitiveness of the game. It didn't seem like a problem that could be fixed with just a proper nerf. Royal Recruit's design was argued to be inherently flawed. Very quickly, it was announced that it would be getting a nerf, which would break the wait-and-see protocol they had been following when dealing with new cards in the past. Seth had quickly taken responsibility for the poor launch and went in depth about exactly what went wrong. This certainly isn't the first time a card has been way too strong on launch, leading to some players to assume this was done on purpose to encourage people to spend money to level it up quickly to give them a major advantage. Obviously, we have no way to know for sure whether or not they made it overpowered on purpose, but Seth's explanation would lead me to believe it was just an innocent oversight. He said when comparing this card purely on a stat basis, it didn't seem that impressive. He compared it to Barbarian, stating you were getting less damage per second and the same hit points for one more elixir, and Barbarians weren't even that strong. He then went on to talk about how Royal Hogs and Giant Snowball, cards released recently before the recruits, felt good in testing but in practice ended up being weak cards that needed buffs. And given that recruits didn't feel that good in testing, and since they were just melee troops, it felt appropriate to bump the power level since they didn't want to continue the pattern of releasing weak cards. And he was also a bit surprised because he didn't think a 6 elixir card could be so versatile. Its first balance change would come only 1 week after its addition, which ended up increasing its elixir cost by not 1, but 2 elixir. I'd say that's the biggest nerf a card has ever received in Clash Royale history. An elixir cost change of 1 already makes a world of difference, but 2 is a whole nother level. Especially for an emergency nerf, which is supposed to be light to make the card just a little less of a burden while they find a proper way to balance it. Overnight, they made one of the most overpowered cards in Clash Royale history into one of the worst cards in Clash Royale history. The team explains that they didn't want to wait since there was an in-game challenge starring them, as well as special chest offers coming soon, and they wanted players to get an accurate feel for the card while they could try it out and before they bought any offers. But the problem was that so many people already spent money buying regular chests to level them, and now those players felt like that money was wasted. Now, Seth had stated days prior to this that a nerf was coming, but the exact change was never told. It wasn't found out until it was implemented that day. Most players were misled to believe it would just be a few stat nerfs or 1 elixir increase. Seth had stated his biggest regret was decreasing the cost of the recruits from 7 to 6 in late testing, so reversing that seemed like the most likely scenario. If players had known in advance what the actual change was, they probably wouldn't have spent so much in order to level it up. The devs had managed to upset so much of the player base in such a short time frame. You had competitive players complaining this card was no skill and ruining competitive play, and you had pay-to-win whales complaining their investment was now worthless. Now, I know some people will argue that the people who put a lot of money into this card are dumb because they should have known a card this OP would get harshly nerfed, but it was the fact that the devs were so secretive about this change and that it was so harsh is what I think gives them some leverage in this case. Also, if you weren't active on Reddit following Seth and reading this long post he made, you wouldn't have had any idea anything was even coming on such short notice. Emergency nerfs were a lot less common during this time, so it wasn't as obvious as you would expect from an overpowered card released today. Even if you were active on social media though, you wouldn't have expected this nerf to come when it did. Seth specifically said recruits were getting nerfed in August, so you might have thought you had to get this card max to have a good chance at a good ladder finish for the July season. This wasn't even a time where you could stock up on wild cards and books to max it out for a few bucks. You had to buy tons of chests to get lucky, so if you were maxing it out in a few days, you were spending a lot. The community was so outraged about this that Supercell actually started issuing refunds to those who spent money to level this card up. To me, this helps prove the notion they weren't trying to be scummy. They made some terrible mistakes with this card, but were doing their best to smooth things over. Okay, now let's dive a little deep into the thought process behind this change. Usually a card gets a quick nerf or a harsh nerf. Having the harshest nerf in Clash Royale history as an emergency balance change was unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever happened before or since then. Obviously, the hatred towards this card is going to be a major factor, but it wasn't just that. CRL was just around the corner, and they didn't want this card to disrupt the tournament. It wasn't fair to those who had been training for months to be destroyed by a brand new card that required little thought to play successfully. It seems like they just wanted it to be completely unusable until they could find a proper way to balance it so they wouldn't have any chance of being disruptive. If they could have just removed it, I think they would have. Seth also mentioned that he wanted to make it 8 elixir because when viewing gameplay, he just didn't feel like when someone was trying to deal with recruits that having 1 more elixir would have helped them much. Since CRL was going to last for a few months, it was looking like this card was going to have to wait a while before the team even attempted to make them viable again. A lot of people weren't thrilled at the idea of this card being competitively viable again, but some still wanted to see something. Royal Recruits had such a short run, and there was a world of possible routes to take to bring them back. The most common request was simply to reduce their cost to 7 elixir. 6 was clearly way too cheap without substantial stat nerfs, and Seth and the players could now clearly see that this card did not provide even close to 8 elixir worth of value in its current state. 7 was the obvious middle ground. But there was a lot of work to do, and nobody was quite sure what route the team would take. The CRL World Finals would finish in November, so it seemed like it wouldn't be changed until after that, but surprisingly they would give the card a balance change in September. However, they wouldn't be decreasing its elixir cost. Rather, they would increase their damage by 12% and slightly change their formation so that you could split them 4 and 2 on either side, rather than each side always getting 3. The damage increase wasn't really substantial. They did a very low amount of damage already, and even after this, they wouldn't be able to one-shot spear goblins. The formation change was great though because it added a much-needed layer of strategy and mobility. Overall though, it didn't really matter. Whether you had 4 useless recruits on one side or 3 on each, they were still useless. For 8 elixir, there were just so many better options. Players weren't happy with the direction the devs were taking recruits in. The most popular change request was still reducing their cost to 7. Once it was realized that they were terrible at 8, the community didn't expect the devs to leave them there and buff the stats. If they were determined to keep them at 8, there was no telling how many stat buffs they would need to be viable. It would just be so hard to build decks around them at their new cost, especially since they're not even a win condition. The action wouldn't stop here, however, because only a few weeks later, something unprecedented would happen. For the first time ever, Clash Royale was going to put some of their planned balance changes into a poll and let the community vote on which one they wanted to see most. The winner would get their balance change implemented into the game, and the losers would stay the same. And one of the options in this poll was to reduce the Royal Recruit's cost down to 7 elixir. If the community really wanted this card's cost reduced, they finally had the opportunity to make it happen. Players were excited, and it was a close race, but the Ice Wizard barely won out over the recruits, meaning they would remain at 8 elixir. This was an outraging result to many. Royal Recruits really needed that change, certainly more than Ice Wizard, who wasn't even that bad before. The buff he got would be so small compared to the recruits' proposed change, and it was just weird that the team would acknowledge that all 4 of these cards could use a balance change, but then only change one of them. These whole vote for your preferred balance change polls was a weird era for Clash Royale in general. Like, I understand wanting to listen to the community to make people's experiences better, but if you're trying to balance the game properly, this is a terrible way to go about it. Because players aren't going to vote based on what's the most fair. They're going to vote based on what they like and don't like to play against and what cards they level up and play. And you're not even getting a good sample since you had to be on Twitter to vote. They did switch up the polls to be in-game in the future, but it was too late for the recruits. Not enough people liked them enough to give them a chance at 7 elixir, so they wouldn't see a comeback. As the weeks went by, Royal Recruits officially became the least used card in challenges with one of the lowest win rates. It was doing worse than even the heal spell in every metric. Whenever Royal Recruits were talked about from here, players were lamenting the Ice Wizard buff, pointing to that as the reason we couldn't get a proper fix to the recruits. Surely the devs would do something with this card eventually. They wouldn't just let it have 1 week of glory then let it rot forever, surely. Recruits skipped the November balance changes, but that wasn't a surprise because they would need a major change to be healthy, and they didn't want to make any major changes due to CRL. It's kind of funny though, because they would have implemented a major change if the recruits had won that poll. Who knows, maybe it wasn't because of CRL, but rather they were still playtesting. There was a lot of disappointment over the absence of recruits, but luckily this disappointment would only go on for 1 more month. CRL ended at the end of November, so now Supercell would be willing to take some bigger risks with their balance changes. In December, Royal Recruits would make another appearance in the balance changes, but rather than buffing their stats at 8 again, they would finally reduce their cost to 7 elixir. It's worth pointing out that most of the changes proposed in these polls were still implemented just at a later date, so this wasn't a huge surprise. But one interesting note is that the recruits' hit speed was increased by 1/10 of a second alongside the cost reduction. According to this poll from a few months prior, if the recruits had won, the nerf was going to be a reversion to that 12% damage increase from September. Their overall damage per second was about 4% higher than it would have been if that damage increase was reversed, so it seemed like they were trying to help this card a bit by keeping their damage the same. A 1/10 of a second hit speed increase is an incredibly small nerf, especially for an elixir cost reduction, but since the recruits were so bad before this, it was right to go easy on them. This is also another historic moment in Clash Royale history for another reason, because it marks the only case of one card having 3 different elixir costs at different points in its history. Plenty of other cards have had their elixir costs changed, some even multiple times, but no other card ever, even as of this video, has ever cost 3 different amounts at different points in their history. Because if you change a card's cost, it's either because that card was really good or really bad, or because a card is in such a bad spot you need to change so many of its stats to where an elixir change is necessary. A rework that involves changing the elixir cost transforms a card into something so different from what it originally was because of all the stat changes that go along with it. It's a change that's always done with a lot of thought. The Royal Recruits are the exception just because of how hated it was and how badly Supercell did not want a chaotic meta to ruin CRL. No other card had their elixir cost changed as part of an emergency change, which is what led to this mess and a good example as to why emergency changes should be small, not the harshest nerf in the game's history. Following this change, Royal Recruits were still not great. They were certainly way better than before, but it was hard to find a decent spot for them. They did see some play with 3 Musketeers, and this battle ramp deck with the Barbarian Hut gained some traction, but they weren't appearing in the top decks. They were basically just okay in a few decks that were built around them. Ultimately, I'd still say the rework was a success because they were in the healthiest position they've been in yet. They were unprecedentedly game-breaking at 6 elixir and completely useless at 8. 7 was the perfect middle ground. They may have needed a few small tweaks, but it wasn't going to need any more elixir cost changes. However, even though the card was a lot better, by 2019 it was back to seeing almost no competitive play. They were great in some situations, but those situations did not come up frequently enough to justify taking up a whole slot at 7 elixir. 2019 was a rough year for the card throughout. They sat at the bottom and didn't really have any major developments. They only very briefly made a small comeback in August and September 2019 and a few off-meta decks that never really gained any traction. The one that gained a little more traction was this Minor Fisherman deck. September was a heavy Fisherman meta, so Beatdown had taken a big hit, which helped recruits since it wasn't really good against that archetype. The Fisherman was inevitably nerfed the following month, and other factors led to a massive rise in Bomb Tower usage, which were both contributors to a Royal Recruitless meta. Even during its strongest period of the year though, they were still severely underused. It was clear that this card was going to need some sort of buff to be viable outside of a crazy unbalanced environment. The next major development for this card would come in June 2020, where it would appear in the balance changes again. Now, even though at this point its use rate was at 0%, it would be getting a nerf. It wasn't for any personal reason though. You see, Supercell had some trouble balancing Swarm cards, so now they were giving a stagger deploy to every Swarm card to slow down their initial damage output, and Royal Recruits just became a victim of this standardization. I know it was for standardization reasons, but this incident still went to show Supercell's bias against this card because 2 other cards, Skeletons and Skeleton Army, were actually exempt from the standardization, and they were certainly in better positions than the recruits were. After this change, each subsequent recruit would take 1/10 of a second longer to begin moving. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it racked up quickly. Since there were 6 units, this meant the last unit would take half a second longer before they began moving, which is 50% longer than before. It was a pretty big nerf. The recruit that begins moving first is always going to be the one on the left, and the one on the right will always move last. So if your opponent knew you had recruits as your main defense, they can pressure you on the right, knowing the recruits will be worse at defending since they'll take longer to load in on that side. In terms of balancing, this nerf was completely unnecessary. It was unfortunate that it didn't get any sort of compensation considering how bad it was even before this. Luckily, it wouldn't be long after this for Supercell to come to the rescue though, as only 2 months after this stagger nerf, Royal Recruits would finally get a long-awaited buff. In August 2020, Royal Recruits' damage would be increased by 8%, so now they would finally one-shot Spear Goblins. This also meant that recruits would deal the damage per second they did from September to November 2018 when they were 8 elixir. This change flew under the radar initially because there were other balance changes in this set that garnered a lot of backlash from the community, but any feedback I could find on it seems to be positive. It had been years since Royal Recruits had any real impact on the meta. Besides those few brief minor upticks, it hadn't had a great performance since its very first week. Even though it didn't seem like much for such a weak card, this buff was its big break, as it had a massive rise in use and win rates following it. The most popular deck that was using them was this Royal Hogs deck. This deck was perfect for the recruits since it utilized their ability to cover both lanes. Along with the recruits, the Royal Hogs and new Skeleton Dragons could be split to maximize pressure in both lanes to overwhelm the opponent. For the foreseeable future, you would almost always see either Fisherman or Goblin Cage in recruit decks to help against beatdown. It was a good time to be a Royal Recruits player. Split lane pressure was thriving. Since Royal Hogs were really the only win condition you could split, it was pretty much the only win condition you saw Royal Recruits with. Later in the year, these decks would evolve to include Zappies and Flying Machine as Fireball baiting became more important. The Flying Machine specifically was included in just about every Royal Recruits deck because not only did it have that Fireball bait attribute, but it was excellent at sniping defenses the opponent placed in the middle of the arena. You see, when you're playing these split lane decks, the opponent would often try to pull everything from both sides into the middle, and almost regardless of what they defended with, the Flying Machine would help immensely thanks to its long range and ability to fly over the river. By the end of 2020, following the release of the Electro Spirit, this specific variant would shoot up in popularity, becoming the dominant variant. And this is the version that would stay on the top deck list for a while, becoming perhaps the most iconic Royal Recruits deck in Clash Royale history. There is one other notable deck I should mention though, which is this Elite Barbarians Balloon deck that rose after the Elite Barbarian rework in November. It wasn't popular for more than a few weeks, but it was interesting to see recruits thriving in a non-Royal Hogs deck at all. Royal recruits were looking steady. Unlike previous instances, they weren't dwindling out of the meta. Its use rate was a bit low, but you'd probably want this card to be a bit lower on average considering how simple and expensive it is. Pretty much all its use though was thanks to this one specific Royal Hogs deck. It was rarely seen outside of it, and it was so popular that some believed this alone was grounds for a Royal Recruit nerf. However, recruits were clearly not the issue. The deck was definitely in danger though. If a deck remains prominent long enough, it's only a matter of time before at least one of the cards in it gets toned down. Zappies were nerfed in March, and we can see a notable dip in recruits usage that correlates perfectly with this change, which helps to prove the notion that recruits were relying heavily on this deck. Now that Zappies couldn't perform as well, the whole deck took a hit. It was still a very popular deck, just not quite as appealing. The real hit would come in June 2021 following the release of the Goblin Drill. Goblin Drill was a very influential card upon release that garnered a lot of Valkyrie, Dark Prince, and Bomber usage to counter it. And those cards just so happened to be great counters to Royal Hogs. So as a result, Royal Hogs were unviable in this environment, leading to recruits rates tanking. This period didn't last long though, as in the next set of balance changes in September, Goblin Drill was nerfed and Royal Hogs were buffed, so things returned closer to how they were pre-June. So yeah, besides that June to August period, recruits had a pretty stable but uneventful year. Going into 2022, Royal Hogs were doing great, but Royal Recruits were finally starting to slip out of the meta thanks to the new Archer Queen. Royal Hog decks have been evolving to primarily include this card and ditch the recruits entirely, and it certainly didn't help when the Royal Hogs got directly nerfed in February. This is the problem when a card is only viable in one singular deck. The meta is always changing, which makes it nearly impossible for one deck to remain on the top deck list forever, and even if it does, it's never going to reach the peak it once had. Recruits were certainly not a dead card by any stretch, but it didn't seem like they were going to maintain their viability if the game kept going in the direction it was going in. There was one notable Royal Hog Recruits deck that rose in June with the Golden Knight, but that didn't last for too long. 2022 for the most part was a bad year for Royal Recruits. They were slipping out of the meta, and Supercell wasn't exactly super motivated to buff them quickly to ensure long-term viability. However, just when it seems like they could die out any day, they had a big comeback in December. This was all thanks to a buff to the Mighty Miner. Mighty Miner was incredibly strong this month, and Royal Recruits were naturally a good counter. Royal Recruits have always been a great counter to Mighty Miner, but since Mighty Miner was at its peak, Royal Recruits were in higher demand. Mighty Miner's special ability was being able to switch to the opposite side of the arena at any time, which could get really annoying as a defender since you had to spend extra elixir to put troops on the other side after you already used defensive troops, which was a huge drain on your elixir while your opponent only had to spend one elixir to make it switch. Since recruits already covered both sides, the ability was useless against them. Not to mention their shields were great against the Mighty Miner's Inferno style attack and Death Bomb. Plus they were a swarm. They were literally the perfect counter. The cost of recruits was obviously a downside, but they were still a really great option in this environment. You even saw Mighty Miner used in split lane with recruits this month thanks to it working better in fast-paced decks. It wasn't long before Mighty Miner was emergency nerfed, but recruits were still doing alright regardless. It had seemed like Royal Recruits were dying. They may have had a few good weeks with the Mighty Miner, but it just seemed like a short-term boost due to another broken card. They had performed terribly throughout this entire year besides that one period. But there was a surprising turn of events. Following the emergency nerf of Mighty Miner, Royal Hog Recruits with Golden Knight began making a major comeback and was actually doing pretty well going into 2023. Golden Knight had saved the Royal Recruits from completely falling out of the meta, but then it was nerfed in April. With several of Royal Recruits' synergizers significantly weaker, they naturally began to struggle. Over the next few months, their rates dwindled further and further just like they did in 2022. By August, it had been 3 years since their last balance change, and it seemed like it was just about time for another. However, they would get something even better than a buff. In September 2023, Royal Recruits would get their very own evolution. So not only were they getting stat buffs, but also a brand new ability. This evolution only took one cycle of the original recruits to get to, and it came with a lot of bonuses. Compared to the normal recruits, their health would be 11% higher and they would deal 12% more damage per hit. For their ability, they would charge similar to the princes and deal double the damage if they hit something out of a charge on top of that 12% standard damage increase. And this change was even crazier because they would only need to travel 1.5 tiles for it to initiate, which was way shorter than all of the other charging cards. There was a caveat to this, however, and that was that they would only be able to charge once their shield was gone. Until that happened, they would move at their normal speed. This would force the opponent to be more careful when dealing with them because if they took out their shields too quickly, they might not have had enough time to prevent disaster. It added a neat layer of strategy I never would have expected. It was perfect because they're used a lot in Fireball bait decks. Sometimes you'd want the recruit shields taken out to ramp up pressure, so you could strategize as a user by placing Fireball bait cards on top of the recruits to get the opponent to spell them away. The initial response to this evolution surprisingly seemed to be mostly positive. It gave some decent stat buffs to a card that was underpowered, and the ability was complex enough to make it more interesting. According to its initial performance rates, it seemed to have one of the best evolution launches so far, quite the contrary of its regular release. It was mainly used in the same decks it was already being used in before, but they were able to perform so much better now thanks to the evolution. In October, you were seeing more Mighty Miner with recruits, as well as a rise of Goblin Giant with recruits. October was the first month evolved recruits were available in Grand Challenges, and they quickly became the second most used evolution. They were now overperforming, and players were not happy about it. They were still considered to take little skill to use successfully, and the meta was generally considered less fun when they were super prominent. So it was no surprise to see evolved Royal recruits receive a nerf in the November 2023 balance changes. This change would be a simple damage decrease of 5%. It sounds like a pretty simple change, but this change actually led to an unprecedented inconsistency. This was because its charging damage was unchanged. For all of Clash Royale history, charging cards have always dealt double damage when connecting to something with their charge. Anytime their damage was changed in the past, their charging damage was changed as well to remain double the original damage. But for some odd reason, they decided to break the consistency here by not decreasing the charge damage. So now it was 110% more than its base damage. Anyways, this damage nerf wasn't huge, but it was something. In November, the rates had settled to a more appropriate range. Still great, just not as good as before. However, although the nerf seemed to be spot on, its performance afterwards was not a good representation of the card's true strength because the November meta was a chaotic mess. The new Little Prince and Goblin Giant were ruling this month, so you almost exclusively saw recruits used in decks with both of these cards. They'd both get nerfed within the next few weeks, but not enough, so you still saw plenty of Goblin Giant Little Prince in December. And now you were even starting to see evolved recruits worked into Lumberloon. They were still really strong. So strong in fact that Supercell decided to nerf them again in January 2024. Originally, the proposed change was to decrease their damage by another 6% so they would deal the same damage as normal Royal recruits, but instead they decreased their charge damage by 8%. It was another minor nerf with no major interaction changes, just something to decrease their general power level. But despite this second nerf, recruits were still thriving in January. Recruits with Lumberloon was only going up in popularity, and you still saw plenty of Royal Hog and Goblin Giant decks including them too. The following month, they officially added a second evolution slot which helped make Recruit Lumberloon even more popular because now these decks could include the evolved archers as well. The evolved archers helped so much that for a brief period in February, this became the most used deck in the game. Despite this deck's prominence, however, recruits were actually about average in terms of usage for evolutions. The second evolution slot didn't help Evo recruits' popularity nearly as much as most of the others, but despite that, they were determined to not create a healthy environment, which was enough for the devs to nerf them for a third time in March 2024. This set of balance changes would implement the scrapped damage nerf from January, so now they finally dealt the same amount of damage as regular Royal recruits. But I think this nerf was a little too much. Royal recruits had below average usage for an evolution, and in this same set of balance changes, Goblin Giant and Little Prince, still some of its most common pairings, were nerfed as well. It seems like evolutions were finally a chance for underdog cards like Royal recruits to be given a fresh chance to succeed, but it was clear that Supercell was just giving it the same treatment they had given it for all those years. They had nerfed it 3 times within a 5-month period, even when its rates were fine. They were giving in to the frustrated players who didn't like this card being in the meta, therefore subjecting it to constant nerfs until it wasn't relevant anymore. Things were getting really bad for Royal recruits. Their rates were on a downward spiral after the nerf, clearly showing that it was now one of the weakest evolutions, and things were only getting worse. The following month, we'd get the Dagger Duchess Tower Troop, which was very influential upon release. Thanks to this tower troop, the meta was becoming very heavy beatdown and siege oriented. Goblin Joe was also rising in popularity thanks to some overbuffs in March, and as you may remember, last time Goblin Joe was super prominent, its counters became way more popular, and those counters also happened to be great counters to Royal Hogs. So it was just about the worst environment for Royal recruits. As a result of all of this, evolved recruits rates had fallen to an all-time low, to pretty much what the normal recruits had before the evolution was added. They were practically useless now, and considering how hated they were, it was incredibly unlikely they would receive any buff. But surprisingly, they would appear in the balance changes in May 2024, and this would be their last balance change to date. Unfortunately though, it was yet another nerf. The evolved recruits' health was being decreased by 7%. However, the base Royal recruits would get a health increase of 3%. So this change was more of a rework. This set of balance changes was part of an overhaul to make it so evolutions would be closer stat-wise to their base counterparts. Following this, regular and evolved royal recruits would have the same amount of hit points. They met in the middle, since just taking away the health bonus would have been even more detrimental to the evolved recruits. Overall though, the Evo recruits lost more health than the base recruits gained, so these changes didn't really help them. As I said, this was mainly part of an overhaul for consistency, not a change that was meant to bring recruits back into the meta. Recruit players should just be happy they gave any compensation for the Evo recruit nerf. One notable interaction difference that came from this though was that it would now take 6 tower shots to take out a shieldless royal recruit instead of 5, allowing a solo recruit to get 2 hits on the tower instead of 1 if uninterrupted. Despite that being their last balance change though, they actually have gotten better since then. The Dagger Duchess still hadn't been properly toned down, and that was a major thing keeping Dex recruits typically thrived in out of the meta. It would finally be properly nerfed in July, and following this change, evolved recruits had a major spike in usage. They still weren't great, but these raids showed that this card was totally viable. Even though the raid started tanking before the Duchess was introduced, the May balance changes had heavily nerfed a lot of evolutions, making evolved recruits better by comparison. Initially following the July changes, the most popular recruits deck was this one that was popular around when the evolved royal recruits came out, now utilizing the evolved wall breakers that didn't exist back then. Recruits were surprisingly in a really good position again. They may have been a tad underused for an evolution, but they still had their place. Things would get even better in October, where they would also begin seeing decent play with the buffed evolved Goblin Cage and new Goblinstein champion. Even all these years later, they're still seeing play with a lot of the same cards. Their rates have been the best they've been since before the March nerf, which is a bit of a surprise. I think it's partially due to the fact that they've been nerfing other evolutions so much since the May balance changes, which is naturally making the strength gap close more and more. The balancing has been nuts since Evolution's implementation into Clash Royale, but despite that, royal recruits have made it. They've had a few bumps, but they remain as a solid option to help perpetuate some really interesting decks. I haven't been a huge fan of evolutions in general, but in the Royal Recruits case, I'm so glad it got one, because without it, I think it would have been doomed. There have been so many cards the community has hated on so much in the past that made Supercell nerf them into the ground and not buff them again, leaving them to rot at the bottom for years on end. And Royal Recruits were on that trajectory before its evolution came. But nowadays, this card is used a healthy amount in a variety of decks and doesn't feel like a pain to deal with. I know people still have mixed feelings on this card, but you gotta admit, Supercell finally got the balance pretty good. As for the future, I'm not too sure. The meta has become very unpredictable since evolutions were released, changing radically with new ones being added, or even new cards and tower troops. I could post this video and 1 month later they're ruling the game with evolved 3 musketeers, or a new tower troop will come out that deals a chain stun which will hard counter recruits, making them irrelevant. I wouldn't be surprised if Supercell nerfed them again either. I really think the card is fine as is though, and the statistics back that up, so we'll just have to see if Supercell cares enough about this card to let it remain in the meta. I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts on this card though. Do you love, hate, or feel neutral about Royal Recruits, and what changes, if any, would you like to see applied to them? Let me know what you think, and also what card's history you want me to cover next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you next time.